Good day. In my last video, I said that the situation in Ukraine was extremely fluid and that it's not always possible when one discusses a particular military development to be sure that between the time when the video is made and the time when the video is published, the points made in the video are still up to date. And that inevitably, perhaps, given how dynamic the situation in Kharkov region has been, perhaps unsurprisingly, that is what happened to my video yesterday. By the time the video was published, the situation on the front lines had shifted. It seems that the Ukrainians have taken control, or captured if you prefer, Balakliye, and they've pushed further eastward into the Russian, formerly Russian-controlled territory. And there's been predictably an enormous amount of commentary about this, and most of this depicts this in apocalyptic terms from the Russian point of view. So the military summary channel calls it a disaster. Bernhardt at the Moon of Alabama does the same. All of this, in my opinion, being drawn from commentaries that you find on the various Russian telegram channels, which have also been writing about this from a combination of rage and also, I have to say, panic almost, or despair, or whatever. Anyway, they've been talking up these events as some sort of a major disaster for the Russian military. Now, I'm going to push back on all of that in this program, and I'm going to say that over the last couple of hours, it's also become a great deal clearer to me exactly what has been happening here. But before I do that, I want to again reiterate a point which I made in my previous two videos, which is this: that in contrast to fighting elsewhere on the battle lines, for example, in northwest Kharkov or in Kherson region, this area of eastern Ukraine is heavily populated by Russian reporters. And these reporters are in turn in touch with various Russian commentators, and it's these Russian commentators who give us the overall view of what is happening on the battle lines. Now, I'm going to say straight away that I found these people to be extremely interesting and reliable when reporting facts about the battlefields. I have also found them highly opinionated people. A number of them, not all of them, but a number of them, can't resist the temptation to play armchair general and to direct the battle, or to tell us what they think, how they think that the battle should progress. And many of them are predisposed to be extremely critical of the Russian authorities, including the Russian political authorities, up to and including President Putin himself, and also the Russian military command. One of the most apocalyptic in all of these accounts is an individual called Girkin, or Strelkov, as most Russians know him. Strelkov apparently is his nom de plume. Girkin is, it seems, his actual name, whom I remember very well from the 2014 fighting. In fact, in my opinion, he has played an absolutely critical role in shaping events in Ukraine ever since the events of 2014, when he assumed leadership of the protest movement in Donbass, converted it into an insurgency, held on for several weeks, fighting off Ukrainian attacks in the town of Slavyansk, and basically created the situation we have today, when there are two breakaway republics in the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. Now, Strelkov, or Gherkin, is a very strong-minded individual. He's, to put it mildly, someone that the Russian authorities are extremely wary and skeptical of. They found him very difficult to control. And back in 2014, they took steps to maneuver him out of control of the Donbass militia. And ever since then, he's played an active role in commentary and discussion about events in Donbass and in Ukraine. And he's become increasingly, and perhaps unsurprisingly, critical of the Russian authorities. And a lot of what he says gets replayed and communicated, and it also has its effect, I think, on a lot of the discussions that take place on the part of all of these reporters. And basically, I would sum up his theme, which is saying that things are going horribly wrong in the war in Ukraine because nobody listens to him. Now, I made all of these points because, as I said, I do think a lot of the commentary, including commentary that you find in places like the Military Summary Channel and in the Moon of Alabama, has been unduly influenced by some of the reporting that has been pouring out from these Russian telegram channels, from these commentators, some of it, in my opinion, ultimately traceable to people like Gherkin or Strelkov and his like. I'm going to say straight away that I have a huge amount of respect for these people as military reporters, but it's always important to say that they don't have the overall picture, and none of them, obviously, is familiar with the thinking either of the Russian High Command or, by the way, of the Ukrainian High Command. So sometimes they spin events, or they understand events in ways that it seems to me fit in more with their preconceptions than in a way that actually describes events. Elsewhere in the fighting in Ukraine, in Kharkov region, in Kherson region, these people are less present on the ground. There are fewer contacts amongst the militaries there. And as I said, the result is that we get actually less information from these battlefronts, even though they may be quite important. And there's less of this commentary that we have to try and work our way through. So I just make this point. I don't want to give the impression that I don't have a huge amount of time for the work that these people do. All I am saying is that you have to take a lot of what they say with a heavy pinch of salt, and it's sometimes the case that not everybody does. And I would, by the way, add that one effect of this doom-laden commentary that they've been coming up with over the last few hours is that we can see that the Ukrainian government and its Western sponsors have actually now started to report this doom-laden commentary from these Russian commentators as part of their narrative about a crisis for the Russian military in Ukraine. So I think, that's another fact to perhaps take into account. So what actually happened in Kharkov region? Well, I think it's not actually very difficult to work out. Over the last couple of days, it's become increasingly clear that the Kherson counteroffensive, in which Ukraine invested a large amount of resources and credibility, was not going to succeed. I mean, it has only resulted in very heavy losses by Ukrainian troops. Ukraine has only made insignificant progress, if it's made any progress at all. There's no real prospect at the moment of victory in Kherson region, of Kherson city being recaptured, or anything like that happening. So perhaps, in anticipation of that, and in the knowledge that the Ukrainian people and the Western public has been told about some major Ukrainian counteroffensive being launched at the end of August or in September, what you saw was a refocusing by Ukraine on the prospects for an offensive somewhere else. And in fact, there were rumors about 3 weeks ago that General Zaluzhny, the overall commander of the Ukrainian forces, had apparently advised President Zelensky that an attack on Kherson region was a huge mistake. The better place to focus on was Kharkov, this area of Kharkov region, in the area of this town, Balakliye, which we've been hearing so much about. And over the last couple of weeks, 2 or so weeks, we've been hearing about a large-scale build-up of Ukrainian forces in this area, focused upon launching this attack in Kharkov region on the western flank of the Russian grouping in ETHEREUM. Now, that attack was eventually launched, and it's clear that it has made considerable territorial progress. Now, yesterday, we were getting reports that the town of Balakliye has come under Ukrainian control. Over the course of the next couple of hours, various Russian telegram channels claimed or wanted to claim that fighting in Balakliye was still underway. I'm going to say straight away that I don't believe it. I think that the Ukrainian troops are indeed in undisputed control of Balakliye. They've also sent flying columns up various forest roads towards various crossroads, trying to capture as much territory as possible. Now, this has led to the discussion about some kind of Ukrainian offensive, and if you listen to the commentaries that have been pouring out of these Russian telegram channels, you would get the impression that there have been major battles underway. Well, I've been looking at these events as carefully as I can. And this is an observation. Now I'm going to make a general observation, not just about this particular battle, but about other battles in this area of eastern Ukraine, including in Donbass, which is that though we know always who is fighting on the Ukrainian side, it is the regular Ukrainian army, there has been consistently less interest both in the Western media and, I have to say also, on some of these Russian telegram channels in discussing who is fighting, who is doing the fighting on the Russian side. Now, I've been saying for several weeks now that it's become absolutely clear to me that by far the greater part of the fighting in Donbass on the Russian side has been carried out by the Donbass militia. Now, they've been reinforced by certain units from the Russian Rosgvardia organization, which is an internal security organization, though it's not clear that those units actually have a battlefield role. We will come to that in a moment. And they've also had some support from 2 specific organizations. One is a Chechen force made up of Chechen troops, which technically also comes within the ambit of the Rosgvardia organization, and whose overall commander is Ramzan Kadyrov, the leader of Chechnya, who's now become an outspoken supporter of the Russian government, and also this really extraordinary organization, the Wagner organization, which it is clear consists of Russian special services personnel, people who were formerly part of the Russian military, who've since retired, but who have now re-enlisted in this Wagner organization for pay, and who play a very significant role in the fighting in Donbass. So most of the fighting, in fact, far and away the greater part of the fighting in Donbass and in eastern Ukraine has been conducted, I'm talking about the infantry fighting, has been conducted by these three forces. The militia, who must account for far and away the larger part of the number of combat infantry in Donbass. Ramzan Kadyrov's Chechen forces and the Wagner organization. The Russian role has been artillery support, intelligence, command and control, surveillance, and air support. And of course, other things like electronic warfare and those sort of things. That doesn't mean that there aren't Russian regular troops, infantry forces, also in Donbass. A couple of days ago, we got a report that units of the regular Russian infantry became briefly involved in the Battle of Marinka. This is this village opposite Donetsk city, where it's clear that the militia was having some problems, was running into some problems clearing Marinka. And a unit from a regular Russian division then joined the fighting and seems to have helped the militia to clear up some of these heavy fortified Ukrainian positions in Marinka. So from time to time, Russian regular troops do participate in the fighting. They played a major role in the capture of Mariupol earlier in the war, and they played an occasional role in the fighting in Donbass and in eastern Ukraine. But largely and mostly, the fighting, the infantry part of the fighting, has been left to these forces: the militia, the Chechens, and the Wagner organization. Now, the militia, the Donbass militia, it seems to me, consists of two elements. Now, there are what you might call regular forces within the Donbass militia, and these are some of the toughest fighters in the war in Ukraine. These are very highly trained, very highly motivated, extremely experienced forces, units which have played a very big role in the fighting, and they're practically, to all intents and purposes, professional soldiers, professionally led. And these units are the Vostok unit, commanded by Michael Khodorkovsky, who, by the way, back in 2014 had an extremely difficult relationship with Mr. Girkin, aka Strelkov. I can remember that Girkin at that time was essentially accusing Khodorkovsky of being a Ukrainian agent, which has turned out to be completely untrue. Anyway, there's the Vostok unit led by Khodorkovsky. There is a self-designated Cossack unit, which is part of the Lugansk militia. It played a key role in the fighting in Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, alongside the Chechen fighters, and is the force which is currently engaged in Soledar. And then there is a third force, which is also part of the Donetsk militia, which is called the Somali Brigade. I don't understand fully why it has that name, but it is currently engaged in the fighting opposite Donetsk city. And its task has been to clear the very heavy Ukrainian fortifications around Donetsk city, and about that I'm going to come to in a moment. Most of the militia forces, however, the Lugansk and Donetsk militia, are made up of reservists. Now, reservists can become very good and disciplined fighters, but bear in mind that that generally happens when they are recruited into regular military units that are part of a regular infantry, regular military, as part of a conscription and conscription drive. It's become clear to me over the course of this war that the militia units into which these reservists have been enlisted are not up to that standard. Now, let's now turn to the situation, back to the situation in Kharkov. Now, if you follow the details of the fighting that's taken place over the last couple of days, one thing becomes immediately obvious, which is that there were no regular Russian troops, no regular Russian military formations in this part of the front. There were no regular Russian military in Balakliye. There have been no regular Russian military units anywhere in the immediate areas attacked by the Ukrainian forces. And I'm going to suggest that that is precisely why the Ukrainian forces decided to attack in this area. They knew that there were no regular Russian military there. The only unit that could be described loosely as part of the Russian armed forces was two Rosgvardia units, troops of the troops with an internal security role who were located in Balakliye. One was drawn from the town of Samara in central Russia, another further east, I believe, from the Buryat Republic, but I'm not going to push on that too closely. I'm not entirely clear where the other one came from. Now, it's important to understand that Rosgvardia units are not part of the Russian armed forces that form part of the Russian Ministry of Defense. They are not trained to engage in fighting against regular troops. Their role is internal security. They are there to carry out counter-terrorist operations, counter-insurgency operations, to guard supply lines, to guard bases. They are, for example, the people who are guarding the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. They're undoubtedly well trained in that role, but they are not trained to carry out fighting against a regular army like the regular Ukrainian army. So, who then was defending the lines in Kharkov region? Well, to the extent that I've been able to work out, and it's not easy to find this out, but I suspect that it was militia reservists from the Lugansk militia. Now, I doubt that there were many of them there, but such as they were obviously and unsurprisingly no match for the regular Ukrainian units, some of which apparently are some of the best units in the Ukrainian forces in eastern Ukraine, who were thrown into this offensive. So, unsurprisingly, they crumbled. They weren't able to hold the line. And as I discussed in, I think it was a video that I did 2 days ago, what happened is that Balakliye itself would certainly have been overrun in the first day, except that the two Rosgvardia units decided to hold on in Balakliye, and the Ukrainian forces, which were not yet ready to storm Balakliye against resistance, that for that reason they sort of pulled back. Now, Over the next couple of hours, we got reports that the Russians had reinforced the garrison at Balakliye, that the Rosgvardia units had been pulled out, and that they'd been replaced by Russian paratroopers, Russian airborne troops. This turned out to be wrong. It is correct that Russian airborne troops, Russian paratroopers, were rushed to Balakliye. It's now absolutely clear that they were not, that their orders were not to try to defend Balakliye, but rather to extract these Rosgvardia troops. Apparently a decision was made that these Rosgvardia troops had done what they could. They'd held the Ukrainian forces back for a day. They'd bought, in other words, time, and that there was no sense in leaving them there when they would be rapidly overrun, when the Ukrainian military launched a serious attack on Balakliye. So the paratroopers were sent in. They provided a cover. Behind the cover of the paratroopers, the Rosgvardia units were pulled back, and then the paratroopers themselves pulled back. At which point, the defences, such as they were in Balakliye, ceased to exist, and over the next few hours, the Ukrainian military rolled in. Now, it's also clear that Russian paratroopers, and there's some suggestions that in one case in particular, they might even have been airdropped, were also airdropped in one particular place, a village called Shevchenko or something like this. Again, my eyes make it very difficult sometimes for me to read these names, these place names. But anyway, they were dropped or sent in. They held the village, which was apparently important for the road system, though it's not clear whether they're still there and whether that was also intended to buy time. But anyway, the important point to understand is that this offensive, this Ukrainian offensive, has taken place essentially against no organized resistance. There have been no Russian military forces up to now engaged in the battle in Kharkov region. And unsurprisingly, as a result, the Ukrainians have considerable territorial advances. Now, why did this happen? Why did the Russians not garrison this territory as densely with regular Russian units as all of these people who write on Russian telegrams channels are complaining? I'm going to make my own observation, which is that I think that this particular area, its importance is being overstated. There's been a lot of talk that the Ukrainian offensive is threatening the encirclement of the Russian grouping at ETHEREUM, that it's endangering the supply lines of this grouping. I'm going to take all of this with a very considerable pinch of salt. Now, I've looked at the maps. I'm not a particularly good map reader. I personally would be extremely surprised if the Russians can't continue to keep their grouping in ETHEREUM supplied, even if this offensive gains all the positions that some people are saying it can, are saying it's targeted at. I say that, though at the back of my mind, I'm going to say something else, which perhaps will shock a few people, which is that I do wonder whether the Russians are as fully committed to holding on to ETHEREUM as some people are saying. ETHEREUM looked like an important capture when the Russians captured this town, I believe in March. But it's clear, or at least it's been clear at least to me, that the advance south of ETHEREUM has not gone at all as the Russians anticipated. I think the idea was that the Russian army would capture ETHEREUM and roll south towards Slavyansk, which is one of these two cities, these two big towns, where the reserve forces of the Ukrainian military grouping in Donbass is located. That was my expectation back in March, April, May, June, but it didn't turn out that way. Instead, this ETHEREUM grouping seems to have become bogged down in battles trying to clear Ukrainian troops from a forested area north of Slavyansk. This forested area, which apparently the Ukrainians have laid multiple trenches and dense defense lines, and it's actually failed to make much progress towards Slavyansk. So that from a Russian point of view, I suppose a case could be made that the whole ETHEREUM advance has proved a disappointment. In which case, perhaps it might be a better idea to transfer all those troops who've been in ETHEREUM, holding out there, and transfer them to some other place where they might be able to do something more useful. I've had that thought in my mind over the next few days. I want to emphasize, I don't know that that is what the Russian command is thinking. On balance, I think it is much more likely that they will decide to hold on to ETHEREUM, and the very latest reports I'm getting rather suggest that. But anyway, putting all that aside, I don't think that these Ukrainian advances threaten the grouping in ETHEREUM to anything like the extent that some people are claiming. Anyway, over the last few hours, we have been hearing that Russian reinforcements, including mechanized forces, armored forces, are now trundling towards this area to basically contain this Ukrainian advance and perhaps eventually throw it back. Now, whether that's what's going to happen or whether these Russian troops are there to cover a withdrawal from ETHEREUM, we'll just have to wait and see. I think on balance, in fact, I'm 99% sure it will be the first, that they will hold the line, and then they will move back, go back on the offensive, push the Ukrainian forces back. Now, if that is correct, then this offensive that Ukraine has launched begins to look very much like the Kharkov offensive that Ukraine launched back in May. Now, some of you may remember that offensive, even though we've stopped hearing anything about it now for many, many weeks and months. But what happened in the case of that offensive was that, again, the Russian forces north of Kharkov were stripped of regular Russian military. The lines were thinly held by Lugansk militia. The Ukrainian forces, the Ukrainian command, saw this as an opportunity to launch an offensive, and they did launch an offensive, and they started to push the Lugansk militia all the way back, or so it seemed, to the Russian border. And there was a huge amount of commentary at the time, lots of headlines about this in the Western media. I remember reading, for example, articles, I think it was in the Daily Telegraph, but it might have been somewhere else, that the Ukrainians had won the Battle of Kharkov because they successfully carried out this offensive. And of course, what was actually happening was that the Ukrainian forces were able to advance rapidly against very little resistance because the militia wisely pulled back ahead of them. Then the offensive began to run out of steam. Its supply lines began to get overextended. The Russian military reorganized. They went back on the attack, and the entire Kharkov offensive went into reverse, and the Russians recaptured all the territory that they'd lost, and now they've been making further advances over the last few weeks in the area northwest of Kharkov region, of Kharkov city. So you can see that this has some resemblance to this latest offensive, this latest Ukrainian offensive. It's an offensive against very weak opposition. Perhaps one could even say no opposition at all. Very little actual fighting. They push forward, the Ukrainians push forward very fast. That gives rise to all kinds of dramatic headlines. Perhaps, very likely, they will eventually run up against Russian regular troops. At that point, the offensive will stop, and then it will run out of steam, and then highly likely it will go into reverse, always assuming that the Russian command doesn't have other plans. Now, as to what the Russian command's plans are, I don't know, but apparently Putin is going to have a Security Council meeting today where he's going to discuss the situation in Kharkiv region with his top officials, and no doubt decisions are going to be made about what to do. So we will no doubt find out the situation over the next couple of hours and days. Now, why then didn't the Russians preempt all of this? We've seen that the Ukrainians were building up their forces about 2 weeks ago. One can't talk about this as a surprise attack, as some people are doing, because there was a huge amount of commentary in Ukrainian media, in Ukrainian telegram channels, that this offensive was going to take place. Well, I'm going to make a guess. I think the simple reason for this is that it takes much longer to deploy forces than some people say. Ukraine has shorter lines. It's able to concentrate troops more quickly, whereas the Russia, with fighting off Ukrainian offensives in Kherson region, committed to supporting the advances in Donbass, and obviously also with this operation in Kharkov region underway, the Russians have had to pull in troops from further within Russia. And I suspect that takes longer. One of the things I have learnt over the course of this war is that the speed of movement in military campaigns is actually much slower than people who talk about these sort of things generally imagine. Those of us who do not have military backgrounds, because you can drive a car along a road several, 100 or so miles in a day. It's a fundamental mistake to think that armoured and mechanized units can do so. Logistics have to be built up, supply lines have to be created, flanking units have to be set up to protect the flanks of any advancing unit which is advancing into enemy territory, or which might be advancing into enemy territory or going into battle. All of this takes time. So the Ukrainians were able to concentrate faster than the Russians, and it's only now, as a result, that we're starting to see Russian forces becoming visible on the battlefields. What the Russians did do, however, is, of course, they sent their fire brigade in, the airborne forces, whose task, as I said, was to quickly extract those Rosgvardia units from Balakliye and to hold the crossroads, or whatever it was that they were, at the village of Shevchenko, until decisions were made and until the heavier forces were brought into battle. So I think this is as I understand it, what has happened so far in this battle. Now, you can always come back and say that maybe the Russians should have prepared more. There'll be constant arguments about this. But, as I said, we don't know the thinking of the Russian command. And overall, I think what I've given is a fair assessment of what has happened. Have the Ukrainians gained anything by this affair? Well, they've taken Balakliye, they've advanced deep into Russian lines, they haven't engaged any Russian troops, they haven't encircled any Russian military formations, they certainly haven't encircled the Russian grouping in ETHEREUM, and by all accounts, they're now becoming once again targets of Russian artillery and Russian air power, and they've been losing large numbers of men, though probably not on the scale of what we've seen in Kherson, given that they can rely on forest cover. But they have gained one important thing. They have been able to talk about an offensive. They've given the Western media, Western governments, the Ukrainian public a narrative about a successful Ukrainian offensive. Moreover, they've been able to do that at the same time that the US Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, has been visiting Kiev. Now, one can be skeptical about the value of this, but can I just say that war is a complex affair. It's not just reduced to a question of moving men across the battlefields, capturing territory, killing enemy soldiers, destroying enemy infrastructure. Morale and psychology play an important role in war. Undoubtedly, what the Ukrainians have achieved, if they achieve nothing less, and we don't yet know the full outcome of these battles, what they have achieved is something which will lift their morale and encourage their Western backers. And from the perspective of Zelensky and his officials, that is probably gain enough. Now, let me repeat again, this is a fluid situation. Much more is probably going to happen over the next couple of hours and days. We will see what the Russians do. It seems to me that it is really very much now in their court, the ball is in their court as to how these events develop from this point on. So we'll see what the Russian command decides to do, whether they decide to reverse, to take steps to contain this offensive and then perhaps reverse it, or whether they make more radical plans like the, I think, extremely unlikely plans, let me repeat that, like pulling back from ETHEREUM, which I've been talking about. I don't think that is what the Russians are going to do, but anyway, let's wait and see. Now, all of this is distracting attention from events elsewhere in the war. The Kherson offensive, the Ukrainians tried to launch another attack yesterday. It seems to have been repelled, again with heavy losses. It seems that the Kherson offensive is now in a standstill. The Russian advances, I call them the Russian advances, the militia advances if you prefer, in Donbass are gaining momentum. So that we've learnt, for example, that over the last few hours, the Somali brigade, this strangely named brigade of the Donetsk militia, has captured an important Ukrainian fortified position on the outskirts of Donetsk airport, known as the Giant Anthill or something like that. Now, I've heard about this fortress that the Ukrainians created. I should explain that the Donetsk airport was the scene of some of the most intense fighting during the earlier iteration of the Ukrainian war in 2014 and 2015. In 2015, to the deep distress great demoralization of the Ukrainians. The Donbass militia captured the terminal buildings at Donetsk airport, but they were never able to capture the entire airport, and the Ukrainians still held on to positions near the airport runways. And they built this enormously strong fortified position there, known as the Giant Ant Heap or something of that kind. And this has been an important place from which Ukraine has been carrying out shelling of Donetsk city. And now the Somali brigade has captured it. And this apparently is an important step towards the further capture, or rather encirclement, of the main Ukrainian formations, the main Ukrainian positions close to Donetsk city in Avdiivka. So this is a big battle that's taking place. We've also getting reports that the Cossack brigade of the Lugansk militia is now in central Soledar, and it seems that their old friends from the Chechen units are now, who were previously withdrawn back to Chechnya to rest and recover, but now being sent back into battle. Anyway, some of them at least, perhaps most of them, are going to be sent to Soledar, where they will no doubt team up with the Cossack unit as they did in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, and will act to clear the Ukrainian positions in Soledar. And we also learn that, building on their success in Kodyma, the Wagner unit, for their part, have also advanced further deeper into Bakhmut city along the Patrice Lumumba highway, and that they're also capturing, or have captured, more units, more positions south of Bakhmut city. So things are happening elsewhere on the battlefields. But, as I said, it is the events in Kharkov region that are attracting all the attention. Now, this is where I'm going to stop today. I've given you an update of the military situation and my own perspective on it as of this morning on Friday. It's highly likely, again, that by the time this program is published, events will have moved on, just as they did yesterday. But I would not be doing my work, if you like, if I didn't give you my own perspective of what's going on. So that is what I have done. And we will see, as events progress, how they develop. And obviously, when they do develop, I will provide you with my further update. Let me repeat again. I am not a military expert. I have no military background whatsoever. I know this has provoked some amused commentary from some people, but of course it is entirely true. Sometimes when one is distant from things, when one doesn't perhaps approach things with an expert, as an expert, one can see things a little more clearly than the experts immersed, or the presumed experts immersed in the detail sometimes do, if they're not directly involved. So anyway, I've given you my view. We'll see what happens next. Thank you for joining me again today. If you want to know my opinions about the death of our sovereign queen in Britain, Queen Elizabeth II, of glorious memory, well, you will have to look for that on our main channel, the Duran, where I'll be doing a program about it with my colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou. Remember, you can also find us on other channels, on other platforms rather, first and foremost locals, but also Rumble, Telegram, ODYSEE and BITCHUTE, and Also remember that you can, if you want to support our work, you can do so via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. And of course you can go to our shop and buy the amazing things that you will find there. Our magic mugs, our t-shirts, our hats, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, and all the rest. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button, and please check your subscription to this channel. That's all from me today. More from me obviously very soon with my further update, and until then, have a very good day.